In 1963, detectives investigated the murder of a woman in California. But it would take technology almost 30 years to catch up with the killer. A trash bag is the only clue detectives have to the identity of a serial killer. So far, their search has met only with failure. But a new fingerprint technology will give them one last chance to put the killer away. In a murder investigation in Vermont, police have their suspect. Now all they need is solid evidence to convict him. The case hinges on a bloody but distorted palm print on the murder weapon. In cases that look all but hopeless, science finds a solution in the telltale marks of the killer's death grip. In 1985, a serial killer was on the loose in San Diego, California. The killer targeted prostitutes and other women. He'd rape and murder them, then discard their bodies in trash dumpsters. To catch him, police needed to identify his fingerprints, which proved to be elusive. On the morning of May 9, 1986, police responded to a call from a woman who came upon a ghastly sight as she was taking out her garbage, the killer's latest victim. When they arrived, they saw a sight that had become all too familiar, a body in a dumpster. This time, the murderer had wrapped it in 2 garbage bags joined with masking tape. After disposing of the body in the dumpster, he covered it with a blanket. Police questioned neighbors to find out if they'd seen anyone suspicious. No one had seen anything out of the ordinary. Homicide detectives came to the scene to investigate. An emergency unit arrived to retrieve the body. The victim was identified as Joanne Sweets, a prostitute. She had been raped and strangled to death, and several of her ribs were broken. That was the serial killer's calling card. Would the killer elude police again? It was going to be a tough case to crack. Since most of the victims were prostitutes, the murders weren't always reported, or the few eyewitnesses were unreliable. But this time, the detectives were able to lift a fingerprint from the dumpster. Detective Dan Hatfield was part of a task force formed to stop the horrid wave of killings before it went any further.
Primarily, the whole focus of the task force was to look into women, primarily prostitutes, that had been found murdered here in the city of San Diego and also in the county. There was approximately 35 to 40 unsolved cases.
The Joanne Sweets case was the latest. With any luck, it would be the last. Detectives believed the killer lived or worked in the neighborhood. 2 other prostitutes' bodies had also been discovered in dumpsters nearby.
We had Tara Simpson that was found in another dumpster that's adjacent to the Joanne Sweets case. The dumpster was located at the T of the alley. The early morning hours, the police were called here. They found the garbage container fully engulfed. Fire department finds that there's a female in there and she is badly burned. A lot of the evidence was lost because of the fact that she was badly burned. Several months after Tara Simpson's body was found here, we go up several blocks up the same alleyway. At another dumpster was found the body of Trina Carpenter. Trina Carpenter had also been manually strangled. She was wrapped in a green duffel bag at that time.
Hatfield was sure the same man was behind the deaths of all the women. But the investigation turned up no suspects. A manual search of fingerprints in police files failed to match the print found on the dumpster where Sweet's body was found. Whoever left the print didn't have a criminal record. The case went unsolved. 3 years later, fingerprint expert Diane Donnelly joined the task force to work on the Joanne Sweets case.
I was brought in on this case in 1989 at the request of Homicide, and this is one of the cases that they had asked to go back and re-examine some of the evidence to see if there was anything else we could do at this point.
She learned that fingerprint experts had already tried using a chemical called gentian violet to lift prints from the masking tape that held the garbage bags around the body. The process can expose fingerprints left on sticky surfaces. When a finger touches the adhesive side of tape and is removed, skin cells remain behind. The gentian violet stains those cells, revealing the print. Experts repeated the process over and over, but couldn't raise a single print. Then, shortly after Donnelly joined the task force, she and San Diego detectives received a break. They decided to make another attempt to identify the print from the dumpster using a new computerized fingerprint matching system. Several suspects were considered and dismissed before a match was made. The prints belonged to a man named Brian Maurice Jones. At the time of the San Diego murders, he'd never been arrested. Since then, Jones had been convicted for rape, robbery, and kidnapping a prostitute. He became the prime suspect in the murder of Joanne Sweets. But detectives knew the print from the dumpster wasn't enough to make a case. Jones would have an alibi. His mother lived in a building adjacent to the alley where Sweet's body had been found.
And of course you could logically assume that his defense would be that he had taken out his mother's trash. So we needed something more concrete, that proverbial nail in the coffin, to link him to this murder and maybe some of the other murders of the women in San Diego.
Even without a print, Dan Hatfield had a strong hunch that Jones had murdered Joanne Sweets and the others. According to Hatfield's scenario, Jones most likely cruised the boulevard looking for victims. He'd pick a prostitute and take her to his mother's apartment while she was at work. He'd act like a typical client, but the evening would culminate in murder. Afterward, he'd wrap the body up and take it out to the dumpster, like he was taking out the trash. Jones was still in prison for lesser crimes, but he'd be eligible for parole in 10 years. If Hatfield could link him to the Joanne Sweets murder, he'd make sure Jones would never get out.
I believe when Mr. Jones dumped Joanne Sweets' body in the dumpster, he probably felt he could get away with it since he got away with the other two murders.
In their effort to prove Jones's guilt, the detectives would pin their hopes on the latest method of fingerprint technology. Stalled for 3 years, the murder investigation of Joanne Sweets got a jump start in 1992. Detectives once again focused on the garbage bags the killer used to wrap his victim. 6 years earlier, no prints were found on the bags. But Dan Hatfield and Diane Donnelly were sure the prints were there.
At the time that I was investigating these cases, it was my feeling that there were in fact latent prints on the garbage bags. We were just not using the right technique. I checked around, I talked with the FBI. What they told me is that there was a technique that was being used in England and also in Canada with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, a technique called vacuum metal deposition. At which point I called Canada. I found out that they were in fact using this technique to lift latent prints from plastics, and that they were more than happy to do our case.
Donnelly took the evidence to the laboratories of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Ottawa. She was hopeful, but the prints were 6 years old. Would they have degraded too much for the process to work?
They were more than willing and happy to assist me in this matter, but they were not too optimistic about obtaining any identifiable latent prints.
The process, known as vacuum metal deposition, was developed in the U.S., but most jurisdictions don't have the money to utilize it. It's used more widely in Europe and Canada. Its main application is on plastics. But for fingerprint expert Pat Laturnis of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, it's a versatile process that works when all other techniques have failed.
It's possible to get fingerprints on things like magazine paper, paper towel, tissue, very fine exhibits. It has a limited application in some of those things, but really, when there's no other way to do it, and it works. If we take the best exhibit, the solid plastic type of exhibits, it's a matter of keeping that clean and then placing it inside the work holder of the chamber.
Handling the evidence carefully, Laturnis places it in the chamber. A few milligrams of gold are deposited on a heating element. Once the chamber is sealed, pumps create a vacuum.
Once it's within a vacuum, the gold source is heated, and that heat is melting the metal. The metal would almost liquefy, boil, and then you can compare it to steam where it would go straight up and condense on the surface that it hits.
A thin, invisible layer coats the plastic surface of the garbage bag. If the bag contains no fingerprints, the layer of gold will be uniform. But if fingerprints are present, the gold will sink into them, leaving the oily ridges of the print uncoated. The process is then repeated with a few milligrams of zinc. Like the gold, the zinc vaporizes within the evidence chamber. It will recondense only onto other metals, so it will only cling to the previous layer of gold. But the zinc won't stick on the oily residue of the fingerprint where there's no gold. The result is a high-contrast fingerprint. The bags were removed from the chamber and inspected. This moment would make or break the case against Jones. After 6 years in hiding, the prints on the bags finally became visible. And with them, a dead-end case cleared a major roadblock.
We knew this exhibit was 6 years old. We knew it was involved in a homicide, which made it a high-profile case. And it was quite exciting to see the latent when we pulled it out of the chamber.
The latent prints found on the garbage bags matched the prints of Brian Maurice Jones. The vacuum metal deposition process enabled Hatfield and Donnelly to connect him to the murder.
The nail in the casket were in fact the latent prints that were taken from the garbage bags and that came back matching Brian Jones without a doubt. There was no way for him to disprove the fact that these were somebody else's prints. That was a nail in the coffin, as far as I'm concerned.
In 1996, the state of California tried Brian Maurice Jones for the murder of Joanne Sweets and several related crimes. He was convicted and sentenced to death. Advances in the science of fingerprint detection had solved a case that seemed all but hopeless.
I feel very good about it, the fact that even though these victims were prostitutes, they were people also. And I think with his conviction, I believe that they had their day in court and justice was served.
The vacuum deposition process raised Brian Jones's fingerprints and secured his conviction. But it was a computer that first singled him out. In another California case, detectives used computer technology to pursue a killer across 3 decades. On October 2, 1963, Thora Rose was spending a quiet evening alone in her apartment in Hollywood, California. She had rented the apartment just a month earlier after separating from her husband and was slowly adjusting to life on her own. Rose worked as a waitress and kept mainly to herself in her free time. The ground floor apartment was considered to be in a safe neighborhood, even for a woman who lived alone. But that night, someone invaded that safety, and Thora Rose became his target. He waited in the darkness as she settled in for the evening. When her lights went out, he made his move. As Rose drifted off to sleep, he pried open a window over the kitchen sink and crawled into her apartment. Once inside, he slipped through the kitchen and crept toward the bedroom. When he got there, he attacked. After a violent struggle, Thora Rose, age 43, was dead. When Rose failed to come to work the next day, her employer telephoned her, but got no response. Concerned, he called the police. When they arrived, they found Thora Rose's body in the bedroom. Police questioned neighbors, but no one had seen anyone enter or leave Rose's apartment. Nobody heard a thing. It was one of the worst crimes the quiet Hollywood neighborhood had ever experienced. Almost 35 years later, Los Angeles police detective Mike McDonough visits the scene of the crime.
Hollywood back then was a completely different place as it is today. I mean, when you think Hollywood back in '63, it was still the movie industry, still a lot of single-family residences here, a couple of apartment buildings, completely different world. The crime rate was practically nothing to compare to what it is to today. Hollywood now, we're averaging anywhere from 50 to 60 homicides a year. Back in 1963, they had 4.
The murder caused a major stir. The Homicide Division of the Los Angeles Police Department gave the case top priority. At first, just 2 detectives were assigned to the case, but the number quickly rose to 6. Eventually, 32 uniformed officers and 2 sergeants joined the investigation. They canvassed the neighborhood for a suspect. Inside the apartment, experts dusted for fingerprints.
There was palm prints and fingerprints inside the kitchen and throughout the house. There's approximately 27 fingerprints that were lifted inside the residence, leading from the front window here into the bedroom.
The police officers working the neighborhood found nothing. It was up to the fingerprint experts alone to solve the case. With the long trail of fingerprints left behind, the detectives were certain they would catch the murderer. Their confidence was well-founded. For more than 100 years, fingerprinting has proven to be one of the most effective ways to pin criminals to crimes. The science goes back to 1880, when Scottish physician Henry Falls suggested that ridge patterns on the fingers and hands could be useful in identifying criminals. In 1901, Scotland Yard adopted the idea, and the rest of the world soon followed. Fingerprinting works for two reasons. First, no two people share print patterns. And second, a person's fingerprints remain unchanged throughout life. The skin of human fingers and hands have raised patterns called friction ridges, which help us grip objects more firmly. They're constantly coated with a film of perspiration from tiny pores. The curves, loops, and other characteristics of the ridges can occur in billions of combinations. At a crime scene, the perpetrator may leave noticeable prints if he touched blood, grease, or another dark substance. If he touched something soft, like putty, the fingerprints may be impressed on its surface. But the majority of fingerprints are invisible, known as latent fingerprints. They're made of about 98% perspiration and 2% body oil. We leave them on virtually everything we touch. Like film in a camera, they must be developed to be seen. The fingerprint experts at Los Angeles Police Department's fingerprint lab have long relied on powders to make latent prints visible. It's been one of the most common and effective methods since fingerprinting began. When lightly applied with a camel hair brush, powder adheres to the moisture in the fingerprint, providing a finely detailed image. The detective then lifts the print using a strip of clear tape and places it on a card with his initials, the time, date, and location of the print. This detailed information is vital if the print will be used as evidence in court. After the fingerprint experts working on the Thora Rose case lifted the finger and palm prints from her Hollywood apartment, they had to prove they belonged to the perpetrator. There's always a possibility they could belong to someone else. Detectives obtained what are called elimination prints from everyone who had contact with Thora Rose.
They were able to contact those people, the restaurants, places she worked. They fingerprinted everyone that was there. They also went as far as local delivery boys, as far as delivering chicken, mail people, newspaper people, anyone that had any contact with this place, they checked out.
After all other persons were eliminated, detectives drew the only possible conclusion: the prints belonged to the killer. Now they could be sent to the lab to be compared by fingerprint examiners to prints of criminals in their files. Whenever police make an arrest for even the smallest infraction, they require the arrested person to be fingerprinted. The prints are kept on file and, in some cases, sent to other police jurisdictions. If the suspect is ever involved in another crime, his prints will be available for comparison. The traditional way of recording fingerprints is the ink and roll method. Each finger is rolled on an ink pad, then impressed on a card with the arrested person's name and personal data. The document is then added to the fingerprint files. Recently, some jurisdictions have begun scanning fingerprints into a computer. The scanner creates a digital image of the prints so they can be added to the database. A beam of light replaces the ink pad. Either way, the matching process begins when the examiner compares prints from the crime scene with prints from police files. Comparing fingerprints is much the same today as in 1963. The examiner must look for matching points of identification. The friction ridges arrange themselves into arches, loops, and whorls. Sometimes they end abruptly. Sometimes they split in two. The examiner considers all these patterns when making an identification. If enough of them match, then he can be certain he's looking at the prints of the same person. In the Thora Rose case, Los Angeles detectives reviewed all the fingerprints in their files. When none matched, they sent a detective to the state capitol in Sacramento to expand the search statewide. He scoured every file, looking at a staggering 30,000 fingerprints. The labor took months, but still nothing matched.
I mean, it's a point that they put in an unbelievable man-hours of time on this case. And even with all that they have done, which is probably thousands and thousands of percent more than what we could do today with our crimes, they still weren't able to come up with anything.
Even though the killer had left behind many fingerprints, the detectives couldn't match them to anyone with a police record. The case was unsolved. The files were shelved, and the murderer of Thora Rose went free. 30 years would pass before time and technology would flush him out. 3 decades after the murder of Thora Rose, a new computerized system of fingerprint comparison went online. The Automated Fingerprint Identification System, or AFIS, promised to revolutionize the field of fingerprint identification. It matches prints in a fraction of the time it took using the old method. Fingerprint examiner Donald Keir was one of the first at the Los Angeles Police Department to put AFIS to use.
This fingerprint system takes time to get used to. It was new. It takes time to utilize it, and we had a lot of crimes to solve.
Keir and his colleagues first used AFIS to match prints collected from current crimes against those in AFIS's files. Then they tried an experiment to see if the system could solve old cases by matching previously unmatched prints. They chose 50 old homicide cases to test. Could AFIS breathe new life into dead cases? To find out, Keir went to the archives in the basement of the police department. There, under the dust of 30 years or more, stood shelves brimming with old fingerprint files. They were gathered from all manner of crimes, some solved, some not. One of the files he pulled contained prints from the Thora Rose murder. It was the oldest case selected. The chance of finding a suspect after almost 30 years seemed remote. But with millions of prints added to police files since 1963, and the ability of the AFIS system to compare them at lightning speed, detectives had a glimmer of hope. But first, the prints from the Rose case had to be prepared. Before AFIS can recognize any fingerprint, an examiner must photograph it at 5 times its normal size. In contrast to prints taken from a suspect at the police station, the ridges and patterns of most prints from a crime scene are faint and indistinct. The examiner must carefully enhance the pattern on tracing paper. Otherwise, the computer's scanner will be unable to read it.
Any place where I'm looping it off is where a ridge in the fingerprint pattern ends. And we want to make sure those are really clear because that's what the computer uses for a search. They're called minutia or characteristics. I check it frequently to see if I'm missing anything. go back over what I've been doing here.
Where the latent print is unreadable, the examiner must hazard a guess as to line and detail. The tracing is scanned into the computer. The examiner cleans up any indistinct lines on the screen and identifies notable characteristics of the latent print. The computer will use these as a frame of reference. APHIS then begins the matching process. The computer looks at several areas of the unknown print. It then compares these points against prints in its database. It ranks each print according to how closely it matches the unknown print. In another room, the massive APHIS mainframe searches through millions of digitized fingerprints looking for a match. In less than an hour, it completes a job that would ordinarily take months. Then, the system delivers the closest matches. But it's up to the examiner to make the final match by eye. The prints identified by APHIS are compared side by side with the suspect's print.
There can be a lot of things that match, but if there's something that you know is pretty obviously a real minutia point, like this one was a pretty big one right here, a little short line, and it looks like that might be it there, but over next to it was a place where another ridge ended. There's nothing like that over here, so I would probably disregard that one.
The APHIS system has had remarkable results. During its first year of operation, San Francisco police were able to clear 816 unsolved cases, including 52 homicides. Los Angeles police hoped for similar success with their unsolved cases. They weren't disappointed. Soon after they entered the fingerprints from the Thora Rose case, APHIS made a hit. The computer produced 3 suspects, among them a man named Vernon Robinson. In 1963, Robinson hadn't been arrested, so his fingerprints weren't on file. But he'd been arrested a number of times since then, so his prints were part of police records. Detectives using APHIS fingered him as a suspect. Detective Mike McDonough headed the new investigation.
My main concern was to see if Mr. Robinson should have been there or not. I wanted to make sure that he wasn't one of the detectives or a police officer at the scene, he wasn't a paramedic, or that he wasn't for some reason a friend of Miss Robinson's, that fingerprints just happened to be there.
When all other possibilities were eliminated, McDonough concluded that Robinson was the likely killer of Thora Rose.
With that, our fingerprint people obtained the additional fingerprints, started hand searching them, physically checking the fingerprints from the crime scene against Mr. Robinson's prints, and everyone is coming right back to Mr. Robinson. I mean, at this point, there was no doubt about it.
Los Angeles police tracked Robinson to Minneapolis, Minnesota, where he was now a family man with a management job in a maintenance company. He denied committing the crime, insisting that at the time of the murder, he was in San Diego at the naval base where he was stationed. But naval records indicated Robinson had completed his training by the date of the murder. His alibi was without support.
Well, what swayed the jury was, I mean, the fingerprints are there. You cannot deny that. I mean, we're not talking 1 or 2 fingerprints. We're talking 20-some fingerprints. We're talking them at the point of entry through the entire house and right up to where the victim was discovered.
After killing Thora Rose, Vernon Robinson managed to evade capture for almost 30 years. His life had changed, but his fingerprints remained the same. After they were matched with those from the crime scene, Robinson was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. APHIS, a phenomenal breakthrough in criminal identification, had finally obtained justice for Thora Rose. Though APHIS has dramatically improved the chances of matching fingerprints to criminals, it's useless without clear prints to work from. But crime scenes are often messy, and criminals don't always leave their prints in convenient spots. In a case in Vermont, a murder investigation hinged on two fragile and ill-placed prints, and one investigator's attempt to read them. On Memorial Day, 1992, Glenn Michelson had a party. He and his friends were putting the cold Vermont winter behind them and kicking off the beginning of summer. But the celebration was nearly ruined by an uninvited guest. As the party was winding down, he tried to make off in Michelson's car with one of the kegs of beer. But three of Michelson's buddies caught him in the act. They chased him off the property and retrieved the keg. With the commotion over and the keg emptied, the three men decided to continue celebrating at a nearby tavern. Michelson stayed home. The group returned to the house 45 minutes later, still in high spirits. At first, they didn't notice their host was nowhere in sight. When they called out to him, he didn't answer. They assumed he went to bed. It wasn't until one of the men noticed something peculiar in another room that the horrible truth revealed itself. A ski pole that appeared to be sticking out of the floor was actually embedded in Michelson's skull. They called the Vermont State Police, who rushed to the scene. Michelson's friends couldn't believe the friend they'd laughed with a few hours ago now lay dead. While the police made their report, detectives scoured the house for clues. Their inspection of the brutal crime scene revealed a bloody knife in the kitchen sink. It looked like the victim had been stabbed several times before the ski pole was repeatedly jabbed into his skull. According to Sergeant Miles Heffernan, the victim didn't die easily.
He was obviously involved in a struggle. Had a lot of blood on his clothes. There was a lot of blood on the walls in the hallway.
When questioned, the three men who found the body told the detectives about the person who tried to steal Michelson's car and the beer keg. His name was Robert Plant. He'd tagged along with one of the invited guests and grew surly as the evening progressed. The men recalled he wore white shoes with pink laces, the same shoes that were found near the barefoot corpse. The cowboy boots that Michelson had worn were missing. As police continued to investigate, a call came through about a car that had run off the road less than a mile away. A neighbor named Robert Salzman made the report.
Mr. Salzman was in the living room with his wife and child and heard the car go off the road. He came out and observed Robert Plant walking from the vehicle to the front porch of Mr. Salzman's residence. He had a discussion with Robert Plant. Initially, Plant seemed pleasant. He asked if he could get a wrecker, and Mr. Salzman was agreeable.
But then, Plant became aggressive and broke a window. Salzman threw him off his property and called the police. They arrived within minutes and found the car on the side of the road. It matched the description of Glenn Michelson's vehicle, but Plant was nowhere in sight. Apparently, he fled on foot. Police searched the woods and found him in a short time, passed out under a tree. On his feet were Michelson's cowboy boots. He was taken to the station for questioning and booked for murder. On the surface, it seemed Heffernan had an open and shut case against him. But Plant denied the crime, and the police had no eyewitnesses. Theoretically, Plant could claim he had stolen Michelson's property after someone else committed the murder. The detectives would try to bolster their circumstantial case with forensic evidence, Plant's fingerprints. They knew prints lifted from walls, sinks, and drawers had little value, since Plant had been a guest at Michelson's party. But they found bloody prints on the grip of the ski pole and on a door frame near the body. If these prints could be identified as Robert Plant's, police would clinch their case. To help him make the identification, Heffernan called on fingerprint expert John Creighton of the Vermont Department of Public Safety's Forensic Lab. Because the prints were etched in the victim's dried blood, they were extremely incriminating and extremely fragile. Traditional methods of dusting with powder would not be effective. Fortunately, Creighton has a well-stocked arsenal with the means to recover difficult prints. How a print is raised depends on the kind of surface it's on.
Basically, there's two different types of evidence that come into the lab for fingerprinting. There's porous and non-porous evidence. The porous evidence is papers and cardboards and things of that nature, and the non-porous evidence is wood, plastics, metal, glass, things of that nature. So depending on what type of evidence it is, will dictate what type of examination you do.
Paper and other porous surfaces leave no moisture for powders to cling to. One classic method for raising prints from these surfaces is iodine fuming. Iodine crystals are placed inside a glass tube. The tube is then packed with fiberglass and copper sulfate. Breath passing through the crystals heats them, creating fumes. When the fumes reach the fingerprints, the iodine reacts with fatty oils, making them visible. A drawback of this method is that the prints will disappear in about 20 minutes when the iodine evaporates. They must be photographed after fuming, so police will have a record of them. Another way to find fingerprints on paper is to spray the surface with a chemical called ninhydrin.
Ninhydrin is a spray or a compound that reacts to amino acids that are present in eccrine and sebaceous sweat deposited latent prints. The ninhydrin is sprayed onto porous material and is then catalyzed, or the reaction is catalyzed by applying heat and moisture, generally by means of an iron. This develops the prints much more quickly. Otherwise, you'd have to set them in the dark and wait anywhere from 24 to possibly 72 hours for any latent impressions to develop that way.
Because the amino acids in fingerprints take a long time to disappear, ninhydrin has been used to develop latent prints as old as 15 years. Superglue has also become a staple of fingerprint examiners. Technically called cyanoacrylate ester, it's used on non-porous surfaces, like plastic, where fragile prints could be easily brushed away when powders are applied. Superglue is often used for developing prints inside a car. The glue is poured into a small container and heated. The car is closed up tightly. As the glue is heated, its fumes adhere to the moisture in latent fingerprints and fixes them in place. The examiner can then use traditional powders without the danger of destroying the print. The Glenn Michelson case posed a different set of problems. The bloody thumbprint on the doorframe near the victim's body was barely visible and too delicate to lift. Creighton asked detectives to remove the section of doorframe bearing the print and send it to him, so he could examine it in a more controlled environment. Creighton's job was to make the print on the doorframe distinct without ruining it. He could then compare it with Robert Plant's. First, he took photographs so he would have a record of the evidence before the procedure.
Items of evidence are photographed before any physical or chemical development takes place in order to recover and preserve any existing latent detail that is present on the item. Afterwards, then we can do the various processes that are applied to developing the latent impression on that item.
Creighton sprayed the doorframe with a stain called amido black. The chemical reacts with blood, darkening the print and making it easier to identify.
The amido black is a protein stain. It stains the protein that is within the blood itself. So when the ridges or the outline of the impression on the finger is deposited in the blood, the amido black is going to make that impression darker. It allows it to have more contrast with the background.
Bloody fingerprints are very fragile in most cases, so they can't be lifted with tape without destroying them, even after they're developed with amido. Instead, Creighton photographed the enhanced print. When he compared it to Plant's, it matched. But Plant could have touched the blood-stained doorframe after someone else committed the crime. And the evidence against Plant must convince a jury of his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The irrefutable evidence in the murder of Glenn Michelson had yet to be processed. Glenn Michelson had been the victim of a callous murder, a ski pole driven through his skull. Robert Plant was the prime suspect, but could detectives tie him to the crime? The answer rested on a bloody palm print left on the grip of the weapon. To identify the print, John Creighton needed to photograph it. First, he'd have to make it more visible. That was easier said than done.
The big dilemma was it was a black ski pole grip, and it was a dark reddish-brown blood impression that was deposited on that. Now what I had to do was I had to improve the contrast, either by lightening the background of the black ski pole grip or by lightening the blood impression itself.
Creighton lit the print with a polylight, a lamp that can project a wide spectrum of wavelengths. The light produced enough contrast to photograph the print. But Creighton faced a second problem. The curvature of the grip prevented the camera lens from keeping the entire print in focus.
I had to keep rotating the ski pole grip in order to come up with enough characteristics within the pattern area or within the latent impression that would give me enough information to make an identification.
By manipulating the grip, Creighton was able to get a clear photograph of the print. After it was processed, he compared the print to Plant's. It matched. Creighton had placed the murder weapon firmly in Plant's hand. The events of Glenn Michelson's final hours now made sense. Detectives believed that after being kicked off Michelson's property, Plant hid in the darkness and waited for an opportunity to sneak back into the house. Once the guests had left, he saw his chance and made his move. He slipped into the kitchen and rummaged around until he found a knife. As he stepped into the hallway, Michelson spotted him. The two men struggled, but Plant had the fatal advantage. He stabbed Michelson repeatedly until he brought the victim down. He removed Michelson's boots and put them on his own feet. Then he realized his victim wasn't dead. So he found a ski pole in another room and returned to finish him off. As he thrust the pole, he put his hand on the doorframe for support. After the final blow, he left the house, stealing Michelson's car for his getaway. But he only made it about a mile before he ran off the road. The bloody prints that Creighton analyzed gave Detective Miles Heffernan the evidence he needed to convict Robert Plant.
It was very compelling for a jury when they, hard to explain or explain away. You've got your thumbprint in the victim's blood on the door molding, and you've got the handprint on the murder weapon. It tells a story right there.
For the murder of Glenn Michelson, Robert Plant received a sentence of 50 years to life. For more than a century, fingerprints have proven themselves a reliable and irrefutable way to link criminals to their crimes. In the next century, their role will increase as scientists improve ways to recover them. More and more, killers will be delivered into the arms of justice by their own hands. Police find a family murdered in their home. The victims are covered with strange marks. To catch the killer, forensics experts must find out what caused the wounds. A request for roadside assistance is a pretext for murder. Can telltale marks on a car battery connect the killer to the crime? Police are on the trail of a psychopath. Investigators must rely on an ordinary screwdriver to stop him in his tracks. Like fingerprints, tool marks found at a crime scene can single out a murderer. More than one killer has tripped himself up on his own tools of death. In January 1992, police responded to a call made by the neighbors of Juan and Olga Hernandez. They reported a violent commotion coming from their home. Upon entering, Chicago officers found the body of Juan Hernandez lying face down in the living room. He was apparently beaten and killed. As they cautiously searched the house, police entered the nursery. And discovered Olga Hernandez was also dead. Nearby lay the body of her 10-month-old daughter. The Hernandez home showed no signs of forced entry. The killer or killers left no clues to their identity. The detectives on Chicago's homicide squad had seen a lot of horrible crimes. but nothing in their experience could have prepared them for what they witnessed that night. From the brutality of the murders, it looked as though the killer had come there with the sole purpose of killing this family. Detective Richard Zuley was one of the detectives on the scene.
It was actually the worst beating I've ever seen. And initially, we couldn't tell whether or not it was just a beating or if there was a weapon, like a shotgun maybe involved, because there was just so much blood on the scene.
The medical examiner determined that the victims had been beaten to death with a weapon that left hundreds of U and J-shaped bruises. Neither the medical examiner nor the officers at the scene could identify what could have caused the peculiar marks. Zuley's partner, Detective John Murray, knew they had no chance of finding the weapon until they knew what it was.
Time is of the essence, because if we can identify what it was, and we were thinking of a meat tenderizer, a tire jack, all kinds of things. Yeah. Now it would be important to get back to the scene or the area of the murder to try to recover it.
Detectives knew that identifying what caused the marks was the first step to finding the killer.
171 dispatch, start rescue, code gray.
Whoever he was, he had thoroughly covered his tracks, leaving behind only the telltale wounds. Any tool leaves its mark on the object it manipulates. In police work, that principle is usually applied to firearms. To see if a particular gun had been used in a crime, a ballistics expert test fires it. The signature markings on the test-fired bullet are then compared with markings on the bullet retrieved from the crime scene. If the markings are the same, the case is made. When a tool is used in a beating death, the task is a similar one. By examining characteristics of a victim's wounds, experts can often prove that one tool and one tool only was the instrument of death. Hoping to identify the wounds on the bodies of Juan and Olga Hernandez, the medical examiner sent photos of the markings to the Chicago Police Crime Lab. Forensic investigator Bill Sherlock, an expert in firearms and tool mark identification, compared the marks against various tools.
Baby that was murdered in this case.
The wounds were consistent in size and shape, bruises left by a heavy object. But in the curved area at the bottom of each wound, the skin had been broken.
We weren't sure what type of tool it was. I was not aware of any tool that would make this kind of marks, any store-bought tool, any of the tools that are used by the various trades. So it was kind of a challenge to try and find out what made these particular markings.
After nearly a week of testing one kind of tool after another, Sherlock could not find an absolute match. The most likely weapon was the butt of an automatic pistol, but Sherlock wasn't completely satisfied with that conclusion. If used like a hammer, the butt of a pistol could have caused the bruises on the victim's skin, but not the lacerations.
The marks looked somewhat consistent with the marks from a butt of a gun. We couldn't explain why we had the tearing of the skin and why we had the shapes that we had.
A chance event provided Detective Zuley with a possible explanation. Off duty, he realized he held a likely answer in the palm of his hand.
At home one day, I was cleaning my gun, And as I'd slid the magazine out of the gun, I was cleaning it and looking at it, and I thought, gee, that's kind of similar in shape to the wounds.
With its magazine removed, the butt of a semi-automatic pistol would have thinner, sharper edges, more capable of leaving the marks seen on the murder victims. Without the magazine and its bullets, the gun would be lighter and less effective as a bludgeon. It would have taken longer to inflict fatal wounds. Sherlock tested his theory on a slab of modeling clay. The butt of a medium caliber pistol produced marks of the same size and shape as the wounds on the victims.
So now we kind of knew that we were looking for, that a gun was used to do this, but we still didn't know what gun or where or anything else. That came later.
Forensics had identified the type of weapon used to commit the crimes, but could it be linked to a killer? Tapping their sources, officers on the narcotics squad got a tip from a prostitute who'd heard something on the street. She told police that a woman named Patricia Johnson seemed to know about the killings. Her boyfriend was a known drug dealer, a Cuban named Reynaldo Travieso. Police brought him in for questioning. He refused to talk. Meanwhile, detectives checked the victims' phone records. On the night they were murdered, Juan and Olga Hernandez had ordered a pizza. Questioned by the police, the delivery man said that on the night of the killings, he recalled going to the address of Juan and Olga Hernandez. But when a woman answered the door, she told him she hadn't ordered a pizza. Police brought him to a lineup that included the suspect's girlfriend, Patricia Johnson. He recognized her as the woman who'd answered the door at the Hernandez home. When Johnson was told she'd been picked out of the lineup, she admitted being at the house that night. She told police Travieso was the killer. Her willingness to talk was a stark contrast to her boyfriend.
He was stoic and friendly and very polite, but a guy that could sit upright in a chair for hours and talk to you freely.
Murray questioned Travieso again. Years of interviewing suspects have taught the detective to read subtle gestures that could reveal more than words alone. But Travieso wasn't playing.
If you were conscious like we are very often on the body English,
right.
very, very, very important. This guy showed nothing, a real sociopath.
But police were sure he knew something. A witness had ID'd his girlfriend who had turned on him, and he was named by an informant. As detectives turned up the pressure, Travieso decided to come clean. The story had begun 2 years earlier, when he and Juan Hernandez came over from Cuba together. They planned to get rich dealing drugs. But that wasn't how it worked out, at least for Hernandez.
Both were in the drug business. And as time went on, the murderer became quite a bit more successful in the drug trade than the victim.
In their first year of business, Travieso had supplied Hernandez with a kilo of cocaine to sell. The street value was approximately $20,000. But the drugs disappeared, and the money never materialized. Travieso demanded payment, but Hernandez held him off. A month later, Travieso decided to give Hernandez a second chance and gave him another kilo to sell. But that too disappeared. Travieso had trusted Hernandez, and his trust had been betrayed. Now it was time to collect. Patricia Johnson's statement confirmed that Travieso had used the butt of his gun to kill Juan and Olga. The confessions had come as a surprise, but the law demands more than a confession to ensure a conviction. At trial, the defense could argue that a confession was coerced, or the defendant could recant it. To make their case, police needed to provide corroborating evidence. They needed to find the weapon. Johnson had told police she'd wrapped the gun in a plastic sack. From a moving car, she'd tossed it off a bridge into the river. To aid divers in their search for the weapon, Zuley and Murray crisscrossed the bridge, tossing out stones of similar size and weight as a medium caliber pistol.
John and I spent a day driving across that bridge with rocks about the same size and weight of a medium caliber weapon. And we drove across, throwing them out of the squad car and into the river. And noting that they were all landing about the same distance from the bridge in about the same place.
To coordinate their search, divers stretched polyester rope across the river, forming a grid. It took them less than half an hour to find the sack containing the gun, near the spot where Zuley and Murray had tossed their stones. The weapon was a .32 caliber semi-automatic pistol. With its magazine removed, police believed it could have caused the unusual wounds on the victims' bodies. But to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, the detectives needed harder evidence, evidence only a forensics expert could provide. Police divers in Chicago had found what they believed to be a murder weapon in a plastic bag. Cuban immigrant Juan Hernandez had taken drugs to sell on consignment, then never delivered the cash. Now, he, his wife, and his infant child were dead. Bill Sherlock of the Chicago Police Crime Lab attempted to establish the gun as the murder weapon. Not as a firearm, but as a tool used to bludgeon the victims to death. Sherlock had already determined that the unusual wounds on the victims' bodies were most likely caused by the butt of a semi-automatic pistol with its magazine removed.
As we're looking at the marks on the victims' heads, it's consistent with the tearing being with the front portion of the magazine well, the thinner metal, the side wall, and also the magazine release back here, the serration from the magazine release.
At first glance, Sherlock believed the pistol found by divers could have caused the wounds. To make a positive identification, he obtained a copy of the autopsy photographs, being sure they were exactly to scale. He then obtained a 1-to-1 transparency of the butt of the gun with its magazine removed. He placed the transparency over the life-size photograph of the wound. After closely comparing the gun's metal edges with the cuts on the victims, Sherlock felt he had a perfect match. His testimony could now remove any doubts about the statements of the two defendants. He'd forged an irrefutable link between them and the tool of death.
What it was invaluable for was in bringing this case into court and having a solid piece of expert testimony to present in court to the jurors and say, this is this because this is the results of my tests. It's a lot more powerful than Detective Zuley or Detective Murray standing there going, geez, it looks the same, I think it's the same. They were able to show conclusively that it was the same.
I'm gonna pay you when I get paid.
Reynaldo Travieso's pistol became a bludgeon by accident. He'd come to the home of Juan Hernandez, hoping one last time to get the money he was owed. But Hernandez didn't have enough. Travieso put the pistol to his head and pulled the trigger, but the magazine jammed. Enraged, he resorted to beating his victim. In the process, the gun magazine fell out. When the pizza man arrived, Travieso had already begun beating Juan Hernandez with the butt of his gun. But the unpaid debt hadn't been satisfied. After Juan was killed, Olga Hernandez would also die, along with the baby she did everything to protect.
And clearly, in examining the scene, it was apparent to us that Mrs. Hernandez was doing what she could to try to protect her child during the course of this attack. That involved a whole emotional thing that you have to deal with too on the scene. You know, when you recreate the scene and you're visualizing what happens, you're creating all this. So you can imagine the terror and the fear and everything else that was happening.
Hopefully we'll never see them on the street again.
No.
Tool mark evidence had made a critical difference in putting Reynaldo Travieso and Patricia Johnson behind bars. Both were sent to prison for life. In Louisiana in 1984, police had to rely on more subtle tool mark evidence to crack a case of murder. Responding to the report of a shooting in the small town of Zachary, 15 miles from Baton Rouge, police found a car with its hood raised, parked at the side of the road. Nearby lay the body of George Thompson, shot at close range with a shotgun. No one witnessed the shooting, and the killer left no obvious clues. But battery cables dangling from the front of the victim's car gave police an idea of what had happened. One end of the cables was still attached to the victim's battery. Had he been the one who needed a boost, or had he stopped to help someone else? The victim's car started without any problem. Apparently, he had pulled off the road to assist another driver. If police could find the second car, they might also locate the killer. A Baton Rouge detective visited the wife of the victim.
Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Detective Tom Harris. I just have a couple of questions to ask about your husband.
She had gone to church on the night of the murder. When she returned home around 10 p.m., her husband told her he had to help someone start his car. He left without saying exactly where he was going. According to Lois Thompson, her husband rarely went out that late. Whoever it was he was going to help must have been a close friend. Lois Thompson never saw her husband again. It seemed to police that the call for assistance was a trap. They suspected the killer may have lured the victim to the crime scene with a plea for help. If so, the battery cables might bear the killer's fingerprints. They were sent for examination to forensic expert Pat Lane of the Louisiana Crime Lab. He placed the cables in a fuming chamber designed to make latent fingerprints visible. But the test results were negative.
Well, we didn't come up with any fingerprints on any of the clamps or the cable. So essentially, the fingerprint examination was a washout, and I thought that I was going to be through with this evidence at that time.
The case stalled until a few days later, when detectives got a phone call that brought them a lead. The caller told police to check out a parking lot at an apartment complex in Baton Rouge. Police found a yellow Buick that matched the description of the second car observed by a passerby prior to the murder. It belonged to Brenda Perkins. The tip was placed by her neighbor, a relative of the victim. Faced with suspicion of involvement in a murder, Perkins was more than willing to talk to police. Detective Bernie Taylor of the Zachary Police was at the scene.
One of the questions that, naturally came up is, well, have you been having trouble with his car? Perhaps, battery trouble.
The car had a brand new battery. Perkins told police she'd had no trouble starting it.
So at this point here, we can, kind of fits in with our thought that, hey, this was a set-up deal. There was no car trouble to begin with. He just was lured out there under that pretense.
Perkins explained that her uncle, Earl Thomas, had borrowed the car on the night of the murder. Thomas was the brother-in-law of the murder victim. But Brenda Perkins had even more damaging evidence. The day of the murder, she'd gone shopping with Earl Thomas. He'd made only one purchase, shotgun shells. Perkins asked him why he needed them. At first, he said for hunting. But with deer season several weeks away, she prodded him to tell her the truth. He said he planned to murder his brother-in-law, the victim, George Thompson. A receipt found in the trunk of Perkins' car totaled $2.97 plus tax. Brenda had noticed both the size and brand name of the shells her uncle had purchased. To check out her story, the detectives went to the same store and purchased a similar box of shells. The amount on the receipt was $2.97 plus tax. Exactly the same as the receipt found in the car. Lane also found Thomas's thumbprint on the shopping bag. The detectives now had circumstantial evidence that Earl Thomas was the killer, but they required something more solid. They looked for what they needed under the hood of the victim's car. Through forensics, they hoped to turn a scratched piece of soft lead into hard evidence. In the murder of George Thompson, Louisiana police were building their case against his brother-in-law, Earl Thomas. Had Thomas set a trap for Thompson, calling for help and then killing him? The case was missing one crucial element, a way to link Thomas to the crime scene. Booster cables were still attached to the victim's car battery. If the victim had time to attach the cables to the killer's car, the clamps may have left marks on the battery. The battery of the car driven by the suspect, Earl Thomas, had fresh tool marks, apparently made by a booster cable. Police asked forensic examiner Pat Lane to see if the marks were made by the cables found at the crime scene. It was the only way to place the suspect's car at the scene. Just like people, every tool leaves behind a unique fingerprint that can be used to identify it. The suspect's battery not only had bite marks left by the teeth of a booster cable, it also had a scratch, apparently caused when the cable was hastily removed. Lane suspected that a single tooth on one of the jaws of the cable may have caused the scratch. To test his theory, he took the cable found at the crime scene and made test marks on a flat piece of lead. A comparison microscope enables him to examine two sets of marks at the same time. On one side were the marks on the suspect's battery clamp. On the other, the marks made by the victim's battery cables.
The ultimate determination in any tool mark examination is, was this tool or this instrument responsible for making a particular mark? And in this particular examination, my determination was the mark that we see on this clamp here in the monitor and this reference mark that I know to have been made by the jumper cables have the same source.
Tool mark evidence had placed the car driven by Earl Thomas at the scene of the crime. A warrant was issued for his arrest. But Thomas had gone to California. His address was unknown. Detectives traced all the calls he made to his sister in Baton Rouge to a public phone booth in East Los Angeles. Within days, he was picked up at the booth by Los Angeles police. They didn't have a hard time spotting him. He was a tall man, missing his left arm. Detective Bernie Taylor and his partner Charlie Clark had already pieced together how the killing occurred. The victim was married to Thomas's sister, but was being unfaithful. To uphold the family honor, Thomas decided to put a stop to his brother-in-law's philandering once and for all. He borrowed Perkins' car, then called the victim, pretending to need help. As the victim clamped a booster cable to the battery of Thomas's car, Thomas retrieved his shotgun.
I told you to leave her alone.
It was a nice theory, but Thomas denied any involvement in the crime. Detective Clark was concerned a jury might think a one-armed man incapable of firing a shotgun.
You ever do any hunting?
Oh yeah, I love to hunt.
Yeah.
Oh,
What kind of hunting you do? Deer? Squirrels?
Just generally hunting.
Yeah.
It's just fun.
What kind of gun do you hunt with?
What's shotgun?
But Thomas's gift for gab tripped him up.
Well, what do you think?
I think he's a con artist. Earl was a con artist. He rambled. If you ask him about the case, then he would start rambling on something else. And so we decided we knew that he did hunt. And so we started asking about his hunting. And so I asked him, well, Earl, how do you handle that shotgun when you only got one hand, you know? And Earl said, well, I just put this arm out like this and lay that shotgun on it here and steadied it. And he said, no problem.
Man, I told you to leave her alone, man. Don't do that to her, man.
Earl Thomas successfully entrapped his brother-in-law with his scheme. But the hunter also unwittingly snared himself. The scratches from the clamp marked Thomas as the killer.
This lead clamp, $1.98 piece of lead, put a man in jail for 20 plus years. When Bernie Taylor brought this piece of evidence into the laboratory, I knew exactly what he wanted before he ever finished the request. And I told Bernie at that time, I said, Bernie, it's theoretically possible, but I have to tell you it's a long shot, but we'll give it our best shot. And ultimately, this piece of evidence was linked to not just one pair of jumper cables, not just one clamp, but to one tooth on one clamp of that pair of jumper cables.
Let you get back in, get set.
In the small town of Zachary, solid detective work turned a case of circumstantial evidence into a conviction based on forensic science.
And so the challenge to us is to find and to establish the link from the crime scene to that individual. And when that takes place, there's usually not cameras and lights, there's not a lot of glamour. There's a tremendous amount of satisfaction in going home at night and knowing that the work that I've done has made this town a little bit safer place to live in.
Thompson's death was the result of a personal vendetta. But in Florida in 1990, murder became a terrifyingly random event, and police were paralyzed by lack of clues. On August 26th, students were returning for the fall semester at the University of Florida in Gainesville. On that Sunday afternoon, Ricky and George Powell went to the campus to see their daughter Christina's new apartment. But when they arrived, neither their daughter nor her roommate answered the door or telephone. The parents asked the building manager to let them in, but the women had changed the lock. The manager didn't have a key. The Powells' concern grew with every hour their daughter was away. Fearing the worst, they contacted the police. A Gainesville police officer met them at the apartment. He then forced open the door. As he entered, he saw a dead woman posed on the couch. He blocked the parents from following him. He didn't want them to disturb the evidence, and he feared the killer might still be inside. But the officer found not the killer, but a second murder victim. Both women had been raped, then stabbed. The brutality of the crime and the way the bodies had been staged made police fear that they were dealing with more than a random killer. Whoever murdered these women was cunning and methodical. Police feared it would only be a matter of time before he struck again. To help investigate the brutal double slaying, police throughout the county assisted the Gainesville police. Among them was Detective Sergeant LeGrand Hewitt of the Alachua County Sheriff's Office. And then the killer struck closer to home.
About midnight, Sunday night, one of our records clerks at the Alachua County Sheriff's Office failed to show up for work. Her supervisor and co-workers got concerned about that and notified our watch commander.
A deputy was sent to Krista Hoyt's apartment. No one came to the front door, but he saw a gap in her Venetian blinds.
The deputy got on his knees and put his flashlight up into the room that was there, and it happened to be Krista Hoyt's bedroom, and she was sitting on the side of the bed in a staged position, decapitated.
Adding to the horror, 2 days later, 2 more victims were found, raped and stabbed in a similar fashion. News of the killings electrified the University of Florida campus.
It's currently 27 minutes past the top of the hour. Just a reminder for University of Florida students back for the new semester, make sure you stay safe, keep doors and windows locked. Call SNAP, the Student Nighttime Auxiliary Patrol, if you need an escort around campus. Police are increasing patrols in the southwest Gainesville area around student apartment complexes.
Special Agent Ed Dix of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement recalls the mood in Gainesville at the time of the killings.
The city of Gainesville sort of started feeling a sense of terror, and the university has some 40,000 students, of which probably 20,000 or more are females. Parents started coming to get their children. It wasn't enough that they called for a well-being check. They actually just started showing up. The kids were calling home saying, "I'm ready to go," to the point that the university was closed for a week.
The police feared a ritual killer was on the loose. A serial madman who'd claimed 5 victims in 3 days. In each case, he forced his way past the locks on the doors. At the first location, he jimmied the lock of a wooden door. At the second and third locations, he'd removed the security pin from a sliding glass door. Special Agent Ed Dix believed the same tool had been used at the last 2 locations.
The sliding glass door had been broken and pried and had left some marks in the aluminum.
The police photographed the damaged areas around each of the sliding doors where the killer had gained entry. A section of the wooden door frame from the first location also was removed and sent to toolmark examiner David Warniment at the crime lab in Jacksonville. Experience told Warniment immediately what class of tool had been used to enter the victims' homes.
And the question was what type of tool was used to make the damage in the door sections from the first crime scene. I looked at them and could tell the investigators initially that they were looking for a 5/16" screwdriver with a type of blade that has a serrated tip or a corrugated type of tip on it.
Police removed the doors from the second and third crime scenes and sent them to the lab. They suspected the crimes were linked, but had no evidence to prove it. If they could match the tool marks found at the 3 crime scenes, they could prove the same person was responsible.
A week later, 2 doors came into the laboratory. The door from the second crime scene and the door from the third crime scene. I looked at the doors and found that there was damage around the lock on the door from the second crime scene and also on the door jamb, which came in with it. On the door from the third crime scene, there was also damage around the lock. And also I found that there was damage up around the security pin. There was a series of scratches in the security pin, around the security pin hole. And what I noticed was they were very typical, and they appeared to have been caused by trying to jimmy the door and remove the security pin and gain entry.
Warniment made a silicone cast of the damage on each of the doors. The silicone is mixed with a hardening agent. When it sets, it forms a perfect impression. After studying the impressions from the 3 crime scenes, Warniment concluded that the killer used a screwdriver with a 5/16" serrated blade. Police now knew that they were dealing with one killer who used the same screwdriver to break into his victims' homes. If they could find the screwdriver, they would find the killer. Over the next 4 months, throughout Florida, if a suspect was arrested with a screwdriver on his person or in his car, the tool was sent to David Warniment. Examined under a microscope, even the blade of a brand new screwdriver leaves a striated mark that's totally unique. It becomes more distinctive over time, acquiring the nicks and scratches that come from use. But after examining dozens of screwdrivers, Warniment found nothing that matched the tool marks at the crime scene. Police had few leads and no immediate suspects. A killer was on the loose, and they feared that more women would die. In November of 1990, 4 months after the first murder in Gainesville, police got a break from a routine computer check. A man picked up in Ocala for robbery was wanted in Shreveport, Louisiana for shooting his father. The computer had already identified Shreveport as the scene of a crime very similar to the murders in Gainesville. It might be a coincidence. But Special Agent Ed Dix decided to look for a connection between the suspect in Ocala and the Gainesville murders. Meanwhile, Sergeant Detective LeGrand Hewitt was following a different lead. Months earlier, shortly after the murders, a bank in Gainesville had been robbed. It was not far from the second murder scene. Shortly after the robbery, police officers saw 2 men enter the woods nearby. The suspects eluded police, who called for backup. A tracking dog was dispatched to pick up the scent. It led police to a small makeshift campsite. There, they found a large number of dye-marked bills, apparently stolen in the bank robbery that day. In a duffel bag, police found a semi-automatic weapon like the one used by the robber, some duct tape, and a cassette player. On the tape was what seemed to be a veiled message. The man on the tape identified himself as Danny Rolling. He sang a total of 11 songs he'd written himself, mostly to the tune of The House of the Rising Sun. The tape ended with what was possibly the chilling prelude to murder. "This is not the road I wanted, but I will walk it like a man. I got something I gotta do." The tape proved that Rolling had been in Gainesville at the same time the killings occurred.
Looks like some blood on the gloves.
At the campsite, police had also found a screwdriver. But at the time, there had been no reason to suspect Rolling's involvement in murder. His apparent MO was bank robbery, a crime far removed from brutal sex crimes. At first, the screwdriver wasn't examined.
The investigators had said it was essentially a screwdriver from a campsite that was occupied by a bank robber. And at that time, no one attached any significance to the campsite. But there was evidently something in the back of my mind that just said, told me not to eliminate the tool.
Warniment decided to take a closer look at the screwdriver.
I placed tests on the from the screwdriver from the campsite on the microscope, and also my silicone casts of the marks from the door from the third crime scene. And within about 5 or 10 minutes, I all of a sudden saw a tremendous correspondence of individual characteristics and thought to myself, I've just identified this screwdriver as making the damage on the door from the third crime scene.
He performed a similar test on the sliding door from the second crime scene.
and again compared them directly to the screwdriver blade in this case, and I was able to see enough correspondence to say that the screwdriver from the campsite caused the damage on the door and the door jamb from the second crime scene.
The tool marks proved that the screwdriver found at Danny Rolling's campsite was the same tool used to break into the victim's apartments. Faced with the mounting evidence against him, Rolling decided to reveal the criminal life he'd led. As a burglar, he developed a talent for breaking and entering houses while the occupants were asleep.
His whole life, I suppose since he was a teenager, he had spent as a peeping Tom, and then as a burglar, then as a rapist, and he was an extremely good burglar. He seemed to enjoy breaking in with people in the house, the cat burglar scenario, and enjoyed being able to go in there and do whatever he wanted to do without waking anyone up.
Like so many other serial killers, Rollings had begun as a peeping Tom, peering in women's windows in the dark. Then he became a cat burglar and progressed to murder. His break-in tool of choice was a screwdriver with a serrated blade 5/16 of an inch wide. He was proud of his ability to open any door without a sound. From there, it was apparently one short step to rape, then murder, culminating on the night of August 26, 1990.
He said as he was peeping in the windows, he saw a girl changing clothes or just come from the shower, which turned out to be Tracy Paulus. And he said when he saw her, he knew that she was the one, his choice for the evening.
The knife Rolling used to kill his victims was never recovered. Instead, police had found a much more valuable tool. Rolling had left 27 scratch marks on the doors at the crime scenes. It was more than enough to prove his guilt.
It is further ordered and adjudged that the defendant, Danny Harold Rawling, is hereby sentenced to death. The defendant is hereby committed to the Department of Corrections of the state of Florida for execution of this sentence as provided by law. May God have mercy on his soul. Done and ordered this 20th day of April, 1994.
Tool mark identification is perhaps the simplest weapon in the Crime Stopper's arsenal. Requiring little more than a visual comparison. But for juries, it's compelling evidence. If a tool can be traced to a suspect, only a few faint scratches may be enough to solve the crime. In Miami, it looks like a burglary gone wrong. At least that's what the murderer hoped. But to detectives, the clues reveal the truth. A man dies in the flames of his burning truck. But the real crime scene is miles away. Can forensics prove that connection? Investigators grapple with a double homicide. The sole eyewitness reports the victims were killed by a ninja assassin. Some kill out of hatred. Some do it for love. But for others, murder is all in a day's work. Their services are available to anyone willing to pay the price for their deadly dealings. In the early morning hours of March 7th, 1986, police received a call from the home of Stan and Joyce Cohen. in Coconut Grove, Florida. At 5:25 a.m., Joyce had frantically dialed 911, reporting that an intruder had entered their home. Her husband was shot in his sleep. Stan Cohen, a 52-year-old owner of a construction company, had been shot 4 times in the head. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Homicide detectives were called in. Leading the investigation was John Spear.
When I arrived at the scene, I met Joyce Cohen. There were only 2 people in the house, according to Joyce Cohen, when this homicide occurred. Now, my teachings and my beliefs are when you have 2 people in a house or a room or anywhere, and one of them ends up dead, you should suspect the other person until your suspicions are relieved.
This right here?
But suspicions can only take an investigator so far, and they ultimately mean nothing in a court of law. The truth is told through the evidence. Meantime, the medical examiner conducted an autopsy on Stan Cohen. He ruled gunshot as the official cause of death. He was told the victim was killed between 5:15 and 5:20 that morning. He had no reason to question it.
If we would have a seat right here, please.
While the forensics team swarmed the Cohen's house,
Get you to put your hands on the table, ma'am.
Joyce went to the police station.
Ma'am, this is
She agreed to a routine swab test for gunpowder residue.
What I'm going to do is swab your hand, and if there's any shots or traces of gunshot residue.
While awaiting the results, she gave her statement. According to Joyce, she and Stan were awakened by a noise downstairs.
I think I heard something. What'd you hear?
Stan picked up his gun, and the 2 went to investigate. A quick search of the house showed nothing amiss. Relieved, the couple returned to bed. But Joyce claimed she couldn't sleep, so she went back downstairs. At approximately 5 a.m., a friend called from Colorado. As they were talking, she heard a noise in the kitchen. She noticed the glass in the kitchen door was broken. She said she hung up from her friend. Then she saw a figure running downstairs and out the door. She ran upstairs to check on Stan. She found him bleeding in bed. She couldn't rouse him.
Oh my God, what happened?
She dialed 911.
Honey, are you okay? Are you okay?
When I advised her that there were some inconsistencies in this particular story that she told me about the homicide, it irritated her.
She demanded that the forensics team immediately leave her house and not return without a search warrant. She said she didn't want any of her husband's things taken or touched. Detective Spear couldn't understand her hostile reaction.
Now, if a loved one of mine or anybody else that I would know was killed, I think they would cooperate 100% with the police. To me, she was not cooperating.
To Spear, it seemed she knew more than she was letting on.
The only thing we can do is
I got some lady captain.
Until the warrant was issued, investigators were locked out of Cohen's house. 4 hours later, the paperwork came through. Joyce Cohen was presented with the warrant, and the team swung back into action. They went inside to dust for fingerprints. Joyce was called back to the police station to continue her interrogation. By now, the residue tests on her hands had come back from the lab. They were positive, showing she'd had contact with gunpowder. she calmly provided detectives with an explanation.
When she discovered her husband's body in the bed, she grabbed him and a pillow, and possibly that's what caused her to have the gunshot powder residue on her hands.
Investigators made a note of her response and pressed on. They noticed that her story changed slightly from her first interview.
Hey, thanks for calling.
Now, instead of saying that her friend called from Colorado at 5 a.m., she said it was closer to 3 a.m. That left a gap of 2 hours between the time of the break-in and her call to 911. Slips like that can mean nothing, or everything. It was too early to tell. The evidence was still being gathered. Outside the house, police discovered a gun in the garden. It was taken to the Miami Police Crime Scene Investigations Unit, where it was examined by Technical Supervisor Sylvia Romans. After photographing the weapon, she tried to raise fingerprints.
Upon fuming the gun, I found some evidence of fingerprints. They weren't of much value, but the most significant thing that I found was that it appeared the gun had been wiped down.
Ballistics showed that it was the weapon that killed Stan Cohen. Because it was one of the victim's own guns, it seemed like a dead end. Except it bore one tiny clue. Romans found a shred of paper facial tissue caught between the frame and the grip. It suggested the gun had been wiped clean with a tissue. It also suggested another clue to look for. Samples of facial tissue were collected from around the house. In a trash can in the back bathroom down the hall from the murder scene, detectives found a soiled tissue with black residue on it. It was sent to the lab.
The lab was not able to determine whether, in fact, the tissue that was found on the gun was an exact match to the tissue that I had submitted to the lab. However, the tissue did have gunshot residue, and it also had the mucuses of Joyce Cohen.
Blood in the nasal mucus matched Joyce Cohen's blood type. It strongly suggested that Joyce had shot her husband, then wiped down the gun with this tissue. But facial tissue makes flimsy evidence. To win his case, Speer needed something more substantial. What he got was a confession from someone who wasn't even a suspect. In the case against Joyce Cohen, Miami police were hampered by lack of solid evidence. But 1 month after Stan Cohen was murdered, the investigation took an unexpected turn. A career burglar named Frank Maglione was arrested for a separate crime. He knew about the Cohen murder and wanted to strike a deal.
We learned that he and 2 other companions assisted in this homicide and were paid to do this homicide by Stanley Cohen's wife, Joyce Cohen.
Maglione knew things that only someone involved could have known. So it was clear he was telling the truth. But even this startling confession didn't assure Joyce Cohen's conviction. On the stand, it would come down to the words of a grieving widow versus the testimony of a career criminal. Feeling he didn't have enough evidence to get a conviction, Speer spent 2 years chasing the other men Maglione implicated. But they wouldn't crack. He had to rely solely on Maglione and the forensic evidence to prove Joyce Cohen's involvement. According to Maglione, Joyce met him and the others at a restaurant to plan the hit. Joyce had it all mapped out. It was supposed to look like a burglary gone bad. They were to arrive at the house between 2 and 3 a.m. and use Stan's own gun to kill him. Maglione's story had one nagging inconsistency: the time of the hit.
So they can make friends.
Phone records showed that Joyce called 911 after 5 a.m., not 3 a.m. They also showed that her friends called from Colorado shortly before the 911 call, around 5. It didn't make sense for Joyce to wait 2 hours to call police, and yet 3 a.m. is also the time Joyce gave in her second statement. What seemed like a possible slip of the tongue suddenly became pivotal to the case. Police suspected that Joyce may have waited in order to create her alibi. They followed that lead. They learned that a guest at a neighbor's house was awakened on the night of the murder by what sounded like gunshots. He recalled looking at the clock. It was around 3 a.m. The information supported Spear's theory, but even this report was nothing more than circumstantial. To truly determine the time of death, he needed the testimony of the victim, Stanley Cohen. Originally, the medical examiner had no reason to doubt the time of death according to Joyce Cohen, and listed it at 5:30. Now, determining the time of death was more tricky. The body had long since been buried. All that remained were photos taken upon its arrival at the medical examiner's office. Hours after death, blood settles in the lowest portions of the body in a process called lividity. The pooling blood creates telltale red marks. From the extent of the lividity marks, a medical examiner can estimate the time of death.
7 by 5 centimeters.
Joyce Cohen's lawyers hired an expert witness who requested copies of the autopsy photos. He determined there was no lividity when the pictures were taken, meaning the victim was killed shortly after 5 a.m., as Joyce originally asserted. But because the defense was viewing second-generation reprints of the photos, the subtleties of the images were lost. Testifying for the prosecution, the medical examiner went back to his original photographs. The lividity was apparent, meaning the victim was killed around 3 a.m. Joyce had waited 2 hours to call the police, proving she was part of the conspiracy to kill her husband. Maglione's testimony put into question the time of death. The autopsy photos confirmed his story. The forensics work on the scrap of facial tissue further proved Joyce Cohen's connection to her husband's murder. At the prearranged time, Maglione and his team arrived at Cohen's house. She was awake and let them in. They already knew where to find Stanley's gun. They went to the bedroom, shot him 4 times, then ran out. On the way, they dropped the gun. Joyce picked it up, wiped it down with the tissue, and threw it out the window into the garden. She then perhaps blew her nose on the tissue and disposed of it in the far bathroom. Although it was never proven, she may have arranged with her friends in Colorado to call her, thereby establishing her alibi. Unfortunately, the friends called too late, or there was some confusion over the time zones, Colorado being 2 hours earlier than Florida. Her own alibi betrayed her. Joyce Cohen received 40 years for murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Frank Maglione received 10 years. The co-conspirators were also rounded up and received sentences of no less than 39 years. Murderers are optimists, always believing they can get away with it. But reality has a way of catching up with them, one fact at a time. On a sleepy Saturday morning in August 1988, a driver on a rural road outside of Oklahoma City was startled by the sight of a burning truck. He got out to take a better look. Curiosity turned to horror when he saw the body of a man lying on the driver's side of the cab, his leg dangling out of the open door. After the fire department quenched the blaze, Oklahoma City police investigated the scene.
Wow, look at this, Joyce.
Yes.
The vehicle was annihilated. A man was dead.
Hey, Mark, can you come over and take some pictures of that?
Back here, a lot of evidence. But the guy from the gas tankers.
While police traced the vehicle to determine who the victim was, the sheriff's department received a call from a woman whose husband hadn't returned from work. Marilyn Plants, an Oklahoma City housewife, told the sheriff that her husband Jim, a newspaper press room supervisor, should have been home 2 hours ago. She was distraught. It wasn't like him to be late. Marilyn said that she'd last seen her husband at dinner the night before. It was just like any other evening. After the meal, he went off to work.
Oh, cool. Can I take some to work?
He mentioned nothing about having to stay late. The make and model of Jim Plantz's truck matched the burned vehicle. Later, dental records proved the victim was indeed Jim Plantz. City officials were left with the sorry task of telling Marilyn Plantz that her husband had died in a horrible accident. But investigators weren't entirely convinced it was an accident. A spot of blood found on the road behind the truck raised questions. From the condition of the truck itself, investigators quickly ruled out mechanical failure or a cigarette mishap as the source of the fire. Lieutenant Ralph Gibson led the investigation.
We found that there was a rag, cotton rag, partially burned in the gas tank, indicated like someone tried to set it on fire to blow it up. The actual fire was so hot that gasoline or something in that order was used, that it burned so hot that the glass actually melted in the vehicle.
The ferocity of the blaze gave investigators reason to suspect that the truck was intentionally torched. The autopsy fueled those suspicions. It revealed that Plantz suffered head trauma and broken forearms, but his truck showed no signs of collision, suggesting he was beaten, then placed into the vehicle. The gases in his lungs showed he was still alive when the truck was set ablaze. The case officially became a homicide. To find the killer, Gibson first needed to find the motive. Gibson learned from Plantz's employer that the victim had recently increased his company life insurance from $50,000 to $290,000. He had a separate policy for an additional $20,000. Dead, Jim Plantz was worth more than $300,000.
The increase in insurance definitely got my attention as a motive for a homicide.
Well, sure.
The beneficiary of the money was Jim's wife, Marilyn Plantz. It didn't seem likely that the young mother would be strong enough to beat her husband to the threshold of death and then drag him into his truck. Investigators asked her the routine questions about the state of her marriage, her financial situation, any enemies her husband may have had. Her answers were equally routine. No motives or enemies came out of the conversation. It began to look as though Plants may have been the victim of a random act of violence. Gibson persisted in the investigation.
As I routinely do when I work homicides, I do a background investigation on the victim and associates and their vehicles. Upon checking Marilyn Plantz's vehicle, I determined that it was stopped about a week prior.
Driving the car was a man named Clifford Bryson. Marilyn Plants was the passenger. Police wanted to know if they witnessed the theft of a pickup truck that just occurred. Bryson said he thought he recognized the driver. It was a man named Roderick Ferris. With nothing else to go on, investigators followed this tenuous lead and decided to talk to Ferris. They didn't have far to go. Ferris was in the city jail, charged with stealing the truck. Perhaps he'd be willing to swap information for a more lenient sentence.
I asked him, did he know Marilyn Plants? And he said, yes, he did know Marilyn. He said, what's strange, she offered him $10,000 to kill her husband. He claimed that, and since he was in the city jail, he had no knowledge that he had been murdered.
Thanks to Ferris, the cast of characters in this deadly drama began to be revealed. Ferris said Marilyn made the same offer to Clifford Bryson. He said that Bryson and Marilyn were having an affair. Bryson was called in for questioning, and the finger-pointing continued. At first, Bryson claimed to have limited knowledge about the incident. But as the interrogation continued, he admitted that he knew about it beforehand. He wasn't involved, he said. The man they were after was named Clinton McKimble. Bryson was arrested as an accomplice. In short order, Clinton McKimble was also brought in, questioned, and arrested.
He admitted that both he and Bryson were the participants, that they were solicited by Marilyn Plants to kill Marilyn's husband, Jim. They waited inside the house, beat him with baseball bats unconscious, took him to 50th and Sooner, and set him afire.
When the smoke cleared, Gilbert had confessions from the murderers, but he had only their word that Marilyn was the mastermind. Unless he could find some physical evidence to back that up, she would go free. Police had every reason to suspect that Marilyn Plants planned her husband's murder. Problem was, they couldn't prove it. Confronted by police, she denied everything. A search warrant was served on her house, the alleged scene of the crime. Investigators pulled back what looked like a new area rug. It concealed spots and bleach stains on the wall-to-wall carpet below. They cut the carpet, revealing what resembled blood stains soaked into the padding. It was collected for testing in the lab. Tiny telltale spatters on the draperies and wall also were collected. In the child's bedroom closet, 2 stained baseball bats were found. Bryson told police that after they burned the truck, they returned to Marilyn's house. Because their clothes were covered with blood, Marilyn gave them the victim's clothes to wear. They bundled their own clothes in a bag and disposed of them in a creek a half-mile from the Plants' home. To corroborate Bryson and McKimble's story, the creek was searched for evidence.
The odds of finding this evidence were actually against us because we had several days of rain and the creek had swelled.
The diligent team managed to find the clothing. The evidence from the creek and the Plants' home was bagged, tagged, and sent to the DNA serology laboratory of the Oklahoma City Police. There, each piece was scrutinized to see if it contained blood, and if that blood matched that of Jim Plants. Only then would Bryson and McKimball's account be proved. The outcome of the case rested on the shoulders of forensic chemist supervisor Joyce Gilchrist.
Oh, great, thanks.
But some of the evidence didn't look hopeful.
I was very surprised that when the evidence was submitted to our laboratory from the clothing that was taken from a creek, the request was made by Detective Gibson for me to see if I could find any blood stains on the clothing.
Cold running water is the best way to remove blood stains. The clothing had been in the current for over a week. Gilchrist was fighting the odds. She knew the chances of detecting blood, let alone typing it, would be slim. To find traces of blood, Gilchrist used luminol, which makes blood stains glow in the dark. The luminol solution must be mixed just before use and applied right away. It was sprayed onto the jeans, then the lights were extinguished. The faint glow provided a glimmer of hope. The blood hadn't washed away. Now she had to see if its proteins were intact enough to identify whose it was. Before the advent of DNA testing, investigators relied on blood typing, which is less precise. To determine the blood type on the evidence, Gilchrist used a technique called absorption illusion. Bloodied threads from the jeans were glued into small wells using ordinary nail polish. Then human anti-serum was added. It was incubated overnight under controlled temperature. Next day, the blood was tested for its type, A, B, or O. Surprisingly, the tests on the blood were a success. Despite its time underwater, the blood was in good enough condition to reveal that it was type A, the same as Jim Plants's. The results were encouraging, but not conclusive, because type A blood is shared by millions of people. To be certain the blood was the victim's, it was subjected to a more complex test for enzymes specific to his blood. The chances of anyone else having the same set of enzymes are slim. Proteins are added to the samples. Drawn across by an electric current, the samples react, creating light and dark bands. If the bands on the sample matched the bands created by the victim's blood, Gilchrist could be certain the unknown sample is Plants's blood. She had a match. The blood on the jeans was undeniably the victim's. This part of the killer's story checked out.
They did such a good job of wrapping the garments that they protected that blood for us, so that when it went into the water, the blood was protected from being washed away by the water itself. And when the items were found by our investigators and then brought back to the laboratory to be analyzed, I could make an association back to the victim very easily.
According to Bryson and McKimball, the murder occurred at Plants's house. The blood evidence collected there suggested this was so. It was Gilchrist's job to prove it beyond a doubt. The blood collected from the carpet, walls, and drapery were not as conspicuous as the blood on the clothing, but the tiny droplets were in much better shape. The same tests were performed on these samples. The results came quickly. The blood belonged to Jim Plants. The murder had obviously occurred in the Plants' home, just as Bryson and McKimball had said. Now, Gibson had to prove that Marilyn Plants knew about it. She was called in for an interview.
She denied just about everything. That at first she didn't even know any of the other two participants, being Bryson and McKimball. Then during the interview, again, she changed the story to fit the facts as she learned that we knew more than what she thought.
Marilyn insisted that she was asleep until about 8 a.m. She never heard her husband come home, heard no commotion. If Bryson and McKimble killed the victim in her home, it was totally without her knowledge. Gibson had to prove that the new area rug wasn't the only thing lying in the Plantz's home. He knew that Marilyn was trying to cover up her involvement in her husband's murder. The new rug could be his most damning piece of evidence.
I was trying to find a way to link her to the purchase of that rug because it was a new rug. So I checked with the manufacturer of the rugs, and they told me one of the primary carrier was Walmart. And there was a Walmart just a few blocks from Marilyn's house. So I got a subpoena for the bank records of Marilyn Plants. And when I went through the bank records, I found a check to Walmart on the day of the killing.
I've got the receipts right here.
Gibson visited the store manager, who retrieved the original receipt from Marilyn's purchase. The itemized document showed that on the date of the murder, she made 2 purchases: a soft drink and an area rug. The transaction occurred at 9:11 a.m.
This is a girl that just reported her husband missing, and she goes and buys a rug at 11 o'clock, over 11 minutes after her store opens. She didn't shop a whole lot either.
The purchase of the rug was proof that Marilyn Plants had full, willful knowledge of the murder of her husband. According to what police could discern, when Jim Plants came home from work that morning, Marilyn's lover, Clifton Bryson, and his friend, Clinton McKimble, were already there, waiting to bludgeon him with baseball bats. While Marilyn cleaned up the house, the 2 men put the victim's body into his truck. Drove it to a remote road, doused it with gasoline, and set it afire. The victim should have been dead, but he wasn't. He made one futile attempt to flee the flames. Then he was consumed. The truck should have exploded, destroying the evidence, but it didn't.
The 3 conspired to kill Mr. Plants for the insurance money. McKimble did it for $45,000 that he was promised his share. The other 2 were going to take the rest of the money, move to Texas, and live off this particular insurance proceeds.
Instead, Marilyn Plants and Clifton Bryson were sentenced to death. Clinton McKimble received life in prison. Many so-called perfect crimes are spoiled by the confessions of a participant. A single word from a reliable source can send a solid alibi crashing to the ground. It was the night of September 25th, 1985. Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement, had drawn to a close. Vera and Gerald Woodman marked its passing at a dinner party at the home of Vera's sister in Bel Air, California.
Thank you.
After bidding goodnight to their hosts, the couple climbed into their car for the 15-minute drive to their condo in Brentwood. They didn't know that their movements were being watched, that they were heading into a trap. Gerald Woodman was a self-made man, earning his fortune with his plastics business. He and Vera were married 45 years and raised 3 sons and 2 daughters. Though he was 67 years old and had undergone bypass surgery, he was still energetic and refused to retire.
You make a right. Okay. So go left.
On his way toward wealth, Woodman had evidently made some enemies. The Woodmans pulled into their parking spot in the condo garage at about 10:30 p.m. But they never made it out of their car. The ringing gunshots drew the attention of one of the residents, who raced to see what the commotion was. He caught only a glimpse of a single figure shrouded in black as it vanished into the darkness. He called the police to describe what he'd seen. LA detectives Richard Crotzley and Jack Holder were assigned to the case. Holder knew it was going to be a tough one.
I received a call at home from my lieutenant, Ed Henderson. He advised me that we had a double homicide in the West Los Angeles part of LA, and that the suspect was described as a ninja warrior.
The media pounced on the image of a ninja assassin on the prowl in West LA. The description was bolstered by the discovery of bare footprints at the murder scene. But the murders relied more on firepower than martial arts. Investigators eventually surmised that the ninja garb was just a disguise, and the footprints were made by the witness. The media still clung to the ninja image. Gerald had been shot once at close range. Vera had been shot 2 times. Police found no shell casings, so they knew the weapon was a revolver. Ballistics determined it was a .357 Magnum, a uniquely powerful weapon. The motive for the crime wasn't immediately clear. Gerald still had his wallet. Vera still wore her jewels. Nothing in the car seemed to have been touched or taken. To Richard Crotzley, the crime smacked of a professional hit.
So, since no property was missing from either Vera or Gerald at that time, and it appeared that the robbery was not a motive, things crept into our mind that all of a sudden this could possibly be a murder for hire.
Because hired killers have no connection to the victim, they're harder to catch. And because the person who orders the killing can do it from a distance and has time to establish an alibi, he's harder to convict. Investigators needed to work the case from 2 angles. First, they would have to process all the evidence at the scene to catch the gunman. Then they'd have to compile a list of the Woodman's enemies to find out who ordered the hit. They determined that the killers entered the garage by cutting a chain that secured a gate. Apparently, 2 pieces of chain link ended up in a nearby planter, where they were recovered. It wasn't a lot to go on, but detectives knew that if they did their job right, this tiny clue could be the first link in a chain of evidence that would lead to the killer. In West LA, 2 chain fragments were the only clues in the Woodman double homicide. They bore no fingerprints. They were brought to the LAPD's Scientific Investigations Division for further analysis. A low-power comparison microscope revealed that the scratches and imperfections on both pieces were continuous, showing they were 2 halves of the same link. The shape of the cut helped supervising criminalist Bill Llewellyn surmise the kind of tool used to make the cut.
I was further able to examine the pieces of chain link and determine that a tool that might have been used to cut the chain link would have been a bolt cutter.
While the physical evidence was being gathered, police looked for a motive for the killings. Neighbors had told police that Gerald Woodman was involved with racehorses and gambling. He might have gotten in over his head. A look into his gambling debts turned up nothing. In fact, he'd done well and had no outstanding debts. But another motive may have stood closer to home. Vera Woodman's daughter and sister had an interesting story to tell.
Yeah, more or less.
They immediately proceeded to tell us about the dispute that had arisen between Gerald and his two older sons, Neil and Stuart Woodman, involving the takeover of the family business by the sons. They were very intense and adamant that Neil and Stuart had killed their parents.
Gerald Woodman had built Manchester Products, his plastics company, from scratch. When he had a heart attack, he entrusted it to his sons, Neil and Stuart. At the helm, the sons wrested the majority stock away from their father, shutting him out. Gerald spent most of his savings trying to win the company back. The ensuing hatred split the family. Neil and Stuart were no longer welcome at family functions. Gerald and Vera were not allowed to see their grandchildren. Everyone police spoke to gave the same story about the animosity that centered around the Woodman boys. Finally, it was time to speak to them directly. The brothers agreed to meet investigators at their attorney's office.
Now, any time that you want to interview a family member regarding their parents' death, why in the world are you going to get an attorney? Right then and then, I think Jack and I decided these guys are involved. Now, how are we going to prove it?
While Crotsley and Holder pondered where to gather their next clue, it walked in the door. Two former LA cops who moonlighted as security guards paid police a visit. They said that a man named Steve Hommick, who was employed by Neil Woodman, had recently hired them to keep Gerald and Vera Woodman away from their grandson's bar mitzvah. The former police officers told investigators that Hommick had given them some harsh instructions.
We had been told that Mr. Hommick had made the statement during a breakfast meeting prior to the bar mitzvah that Neil had told Steve, what are you going to do if he comes around? And Steve had replied that he would waste him.
A background check on Steve Hommick revealed that he was a former LA cop who had been fired after less than 1 year on the force. He was now living in Las Vegas and was under FBI surveillance for drug trafficking. He and a business associate had flown from Las Vegas to LA the day before the killings and had returned to Vegas the day after. Placing Hommick in Los Angeles on the night of the murders was a start. But LA's a big city, and Hommick could have gone anywhere. Police learned that his brother, Robert Hommick, lived less than 4 miles from the crime scene.
We also discovered that Robert Hommick was involved in a traffic accident the night of the murders within a half a block of the murders.
This seemed like more than a coincidence. Hommick's accident took place in the alley behind the Woodman's condo. Robert Hommick's record also showed that 3 months before the murders, he had been questioned by police for apparently loitering around Vera and Gerald's building. It was the date of the Woodman's anniversary, one of the few times Vera Woodman left the condo.
On our friend Jesse.
Investigators suspected that the Woodman boys had hired the Hommicks to kill their parents. It would take more than the evidence at hand to prove it. Federal agents had already put traces on Steve Hommick's phone in Las Vegas. Many of the calls were to his brother, to the Woodman's sons' homes and office, and to payphones near their houses. Phone records for all of the suspects were analyzed. They showed a flurry of activity just before the murders.
And looking at those records and our records, we started putting everything together that there was all kinds of conversations linking these suspects to each other.
It was enough to obtain a search warrant for Steve Hommick's apartment. There they found copious diaries detailing his activities. But he gave everyone a nickname, wrote everything in code. investigators were able to crack it. One of the things police learned from the diaries was that Stuart Woodman had hired Robert Hommick to burglarize his own house so he could collect on the insurance. He also stole and torched a company car for the same reason. If Hommick was involved with the murder for hire, he wasn't so rash as to write about it. But his books did suggest that his brother Robert was often his partner in crime. Investigators next served a warrant on Robert Hommick's apartment, 4 miles from the murder scene. There, they found a new pair of bolt cutters. Assuming that Robert Hommick wouldn't have traveled far to purchase the tool, detectives spoke to the clerk at the hardware store just down the street from his apartment. The clerk confirmed that the cutter could make short work of chain link, and she recognized Hommick from pictures detectives showed her. She had sold him the cutter. The bolt cutter was sent to the forensics lab to see if it was the tool that sheared the link outside the victim's parking garage. Bill Llewellyn focused his microscope on the minute scrapings, or stria, on the blades.
Essentially, they are the bolt cutter's fingerprint. They are present on that bolt cutter, and no other bolt cutter will have the same set of stri pattern.
What's really unusual about the bolt cutters in this case is they were virtually brand new, and you could actually see marks on the jaws of the bolt cutters where they had been used to cut the chain link, which made my job much easier in that I had a very small area in which to focus my examination for the stri patterns.
After examining the blade, Llewellyn used it to cut a small piece of lead. The soft metal became impressed with the blade's stria without damaging the tool's cutting surface. The stria on the lead was then compared with the stria on the chain link. From the comparison of the stria, Llewellyn could determine indisputably that this bolt cutter cut this link. The broken chain was the missing link that Holder needed. It bound Robert Hommick to the scene of the crime, while the phone records and diary entries connected him to the Woodman brothers. But without witnesses or motive, the case was far from being locked up. Investigators struggled for 6 months to build their case against the Hommicks and the Woodman brothers. And then came a break. One of the Hommick's partners was arrested for unrelated charges. To reduce his sentence, he confessed to being a lookout on the night the victims were killed. He said that the Woodman brothers ordered the hit. That left only the motive. On the surface, it seemed like the Woodman sons had already gotten what they wanted. They'd stolen their father's successful company out from under him. Why, except for sheer hatred, would they want to kill their parents? The fact was, under Neal and Stewart's control, the company started to falter badly. They were doctoring the books. According to Detective Holder, they were desperate.
They had milked the company for every cent they could. They were being audited by the banks, and they were about to go under, and they couldn't stand the thought of their father seeing them lose and go bankrupt.
Fired by hatred, motivated by greed, and doomed by incompetence, Neal and Stuart Woodman took their father's company and destroyed it. Vera Woodman had a $500,000 life insurance policy payable to the company. It wasn't enough to get Manchester Products out of debt, but it was the only hope the Woodman boys held. Holder and Crotsley, with the help of criminalist Bill Llewellyn, had their evidence in place and were ready to arrest and prosecute. Armed with phone records, journal entries, a henchman's confession, and the cut chain link, they were able to tell their story of murder for hire.
Was the first time that LAPD had put on a case where they used tool mark impressions as evidence.
The evidence was enough to convince the jury. For conspiracy to murder Vera and Gerald Woodman, Neil and Stuart Woodman received life in prison. Robert Hommick, life without parole, and Steve Hommick, death. There may be honor among thieves, but the same cannot be said of murderers. When the heat's turned up, confidences are broken, partners betrayed. And an assassin who's only in it for the money is willing to pay any price to save his own life. Once he agrees to bargain, it's up to forensics to determine the truth of his tale.